The man was not supposed to be there at that hour, and definitely not to find what he found. Henrique walked across the deck of his yacht with the quiet confidence of someone who controlled every aspect of his life. The ocean was still. The night was silent. Until something broke that silence. A small object on the floor. A backpack. Old. Worn. Completely out of place. It didn't belong there. Henrique frowned, taking a slow step forward. And then he saw them. Not clearly. Not completely. Just enough. Two small shapes. Still. Too still. His body tightened instantly. It wasn't fear. It was something worse. That feeling that something was deeply wrong. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady. But no answer came. The wind moved softly across the deck, brushing against loose fabric nearby. But those shapes didn't react. Henrique lowered his gaze again. The backpack. The small shoes. Everything pointed to something real, and at the same time made no sense at all. This place was secured. No one entered without permission. No one. So how did they get there? His mind started racing. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't random. This was a situation, and someone had placed him right in the middle of it. Henrique took another step forward, slower this time, more careful, as if any sudden movement could break something invisible in the air. "This shouldn't be happening," he muttered. But it was. And the worst part, he still didn't understand why. Henrique didn't move for several seconds, not because he didn't want to, but because his mind was still trying to force a logical explanation, and failing. That irritated him, because in his world, everything had a reason. Everything had structure. Everything had control. But this didn't. He looked again at the two small figures. Still the same. Too quiet. Too still. The kind of stillness that doesn't feel natural. The kind that presses on you, forces you to react. Henrique exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding something heavier than just breath, and stepped closer. One step, then another, measured, controlled. That's how he always operated. But this time, control wasn't giving him answers. As he got closer, the shapes became clearer. Not objects, not shadows. Children, two of them, around the same age, lying side by side, unmoving. His heart hit harder against his chest, not because they were there, but because of where they were. "What are you doing here?" he murmured, not really expecting an answer. He scanned the surroundings. Nothing. The port in the distance, dark, silent, too silent. That was the second thing that didn't fit. A port is never completely silent. Never. There's always movement, always noise, always someone. But tonight, nothing. And that's when something shifted inside him. Not fear, instinct. That subtle, uncomfortable awareness that comes before understanding. The kind you can't ignore. Henrique slowly turned his head toward the horizon. His eyes narrowed. There was something there. Not clear, not fully visible, but enough. A figure standing at the dock, still, watching. He didn't need to see the face to understand. That person wasn't there by chance. They were observing, waiting, and in that moment, everything stopped being confusing and started becoming dangerous. Henrique looked back at the children, then at the backpack, then again toward the dock. His mind connected the pieces fast. This wasn't abandonment. This wasn't an accident. This was arranged, designed, and he was part of it. "No," he whispered under his breath. But denial didn't last. The figure at the dock took a small step forward, almost unnoticeable. But Henrique saw it, and that changed everything. Because now there was no doubt. Someone was involved, and that someone wasn't hiding. They wanted to be seen, and that made it worse. Much worse. Henrique instinctively took half a step back, not out of fear, out of calculation, Because when someone wants you to see them, it means they already have control. And then the micro-turn happened. Small, but enough to shift everything. One of the children moved, just slightly, a minimal motion, but Henrique caught it, and that forced an immediate decision. Because now this wasn't just a strange situation, now there was life involved, and that removed any space for hesitation. He crouched slightly, close, but without touching, observing, confirming, breathing, slow, but there, both of them, alive. And that made everything more urgent, more dangerous, more real. Henrique lifted his gaze again toward the dock. The figure was still there, watching, waiting, as if they already knew what would happen next, as if the next move wasn't theirs, but his, and that was the real problem. Because in that moment, Henrique realized something he didn't want to admit. He didn't have full control, not this time, and that had never happened before. Never. He looked again at the children, then at the surroundings, then back at the figure, and something in his expression changed. Not fear, not confusion, decision beginning to form. Because now the question was no longer, what is happening? Now the question was something else, something far more dangerous. What do I do now? Henrique didn't answer his own question, but his body did. He slowly straightened up, without taking his eyes off the dock. The figure was still there, unmoving, patient, as if time didn't matter. And that was the most disturbing part. Because there are only two types of people who can stand still like that in a situation like this: those who don't understand what's happening, and those who understand everything. Henrique had no doubt which one this was. He looked back at the children. They were breathing, slow, uneven, but alive. That ruled one thing out, but opened a dozen more. Were they sedated? Asleep? Terrified? Had they come here on their own? No, that didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. "This is staged," he said under his breath. And the moment he said it, he knew it was probably true. There were no signs of forced entry, no chaos, no mistakes. Everything was too clean, too precise. That meant only one thing. Someone had planned this, and they had planned it for him. Henrique took a step back, then another, not to distance himself from the children, but to widen his field of vision, to think, to analyze. But the pressure in his chest wasn't just tension anymore. It was urgency, and that was new. Because Henrique didn't operate on urgency. He operated on control always, but now, every second felt heavier. He looked back at the dock. The figure moved. This time it wasn't subtle. It was clear. A step forward, then another. Slow, no rush, as if there was no need to hurry. Henrique felt something tighten inside him. Not fear, recognition. That person wasn't improvising. They were executing, and that meant the next move wouldn't be random. It would be part of a sequence. And then it happened. A sound, soft, but completely out of place. A metallic knock from the rear of the yacht. Henrique turned instantly, nothing visible. But the sound was real. And now it wasn't just the children. It wasn't just the figure. There was more, much more. "I'm not alone," he murmured. And that changed everything, because a visible threat can be managed, but one you can't see. No. Henrique stepped toward the center of the deck, not retreating, repositioning, trying not to expose himself, trying to keep the children within view, trying not to lose sight of the dock. Too many variables, too many angles. And then, for the first time, he realized something he didn't like. He couldn't control everything, and that forced a decision. The figure at the dock took another step. Closer now, still far, but no longer distant, no longer abstract. Real, present, watching him. Henrique narrowed his eyes, trying to make out more details, but the lighting worked against him. The shadows protected that person. And that wasn't accidental. Nothing was. He looked back at the children. One of them moved again, a slight motion, a faint sound, a weak attempt to react. And that shifted the priority completely. This was no longer a situation. It was a responsibility, and that was far more dangerous because a situation can be analyzed, but a life can't be paused. Henrique took a deep breath, and then did something he hadn't done in years. He stopped thinking in terms of advantage and started thinking in terms of consequences. If he walked away, he left them behind. If he stayed, he stepped into the game. There was no third option. The sound came again, closer this time. A scrape, movement. Someone was on the yacht. That was no longer a possibility. It was fact. Henrique slowly turned his body, not fully exposing his back, not losing reference points, but now his attention was split. Dock, children, interior, 3 fronts. Impossible to cover all of them. And that was exactly what whoever set this up wanted. Overload, pressure, loss of control, and it was working. But Henrique wasn't just anyone. He didn't break easily. His mind began reorganizing priorities. Fast, precise, cold. First, the children. Second, the immediate threat. Third, the external observer. But even that order had a flaw, because he didn't know which one was the real danger. And then the figure at the dock stopped, completely, and slowly raised an arm, not pointing, not signaling, just marking, presence, as if saying, "I'm here." And in that moment, Henrique understood something deeper. This wasn't just a trap. It was a message, and he was the intended recipient, a message delivered in stages. First the children, then the watcher, now the pressure. What came next? He didn't know. But he knew something else. He couldn't wait to find out, because time was no longer on his side. Henrique clenched his jaw. His eyes moved from the children, to the interior, to the dock. And in that moment, the decision started becoming real, not complete, not final, but irreversible in direction. Because he had already crossed the point where he could pretend he wasn't involved. Now he was, completely. And whatever he did next would define everything that followed. Henrique stopped looking at the dock, not because the threat had disappeared, but because he understood something more important. It didn't matter who was out there. What mattered was what was already here, and that could no longer be ignored. He turned fully toward the children, for the first time without splitting his attention, without calculating, without trying to control everything at once. And in that moment, something shifted inside him. Not fear, not pressure, recognition. One of the children moved again, more than before, a slight tremor in the hand, an attempt to react. Henrique slowly crouched, closer now, but still careful, not invading, not touching, observing, looking for signs, looking for answers. But what he found was not what he expected. There was something in that face, something that didn't fit. It wasn't just the age, it wasn't just the situation, it was something deeper, something familiar. Henrique frowned, leaning in slightly. The side light of the yacht touched part of the child's face, and then it happened. A silent impact, but devastating. It couldn't be. It simply couldn't be. He pulled back just a fraction, as if he needed distance to think, to deny, to reconstruct what he was seeing, but his mind didn't respond, because deep down, it already knew. That face was not entirely unfamiliar. There were details, subtle, but undeniable. A line in the jaw, a shape in the eyes, something that isn't learned, something that's inherited. "No," he whispered, but this time it wasn't doubt. It was resistance. The second child moved slightly, and that destroyed any remaining denial. 2. Not 1. 2. And both carried something impossible to ignore. Henrique felt his breathing shift. It was no longer controlled, no longer measured. It was human, unstable. Because now the situation wasn't external anymore. It wasn't just a trap. It was personal. Directly. Painfully. Personal. His gaze dropped slowly to the backpack. There was something there. A detail he hadn't noticed before. A small side pocket. Slightly open. Henrique hesitated. 1 second. 2. But there was no room left for hesitation. He reached for it. Slowly. Carefully. As if any wrong move could break. Something more than just the moment. He opened the compartment. Inside, an envelope. White. Plain. Too plain. No name. No mark. No explanation. That made it worse. Henrique took it. The paper made a faint sound. In that silence, it felt louder than it should have. He glanced once more toward the dock. The figure was still there, watching, waiting, as if they already knew what he held in his hands, as if this was the next step. And it was. Henrique opened the envelope, pulled out the document. Official, clear, direct, enough. He didn't need to read everything, just one line, and it was enough. His expression changed completely, not surprise, not confusion. Something deeper, something that couldn't be hidden. Absolute recognition, the kind of truth that doesn't need explanation, the kind that breaks everything that came before, the kind that leaves no way back. His fingers tightened slightly around the paper. His gaze slowly returned to the children, and this time he didn't see strangers. He saw something he never expected to find, something he never searched for, something he never even knew existed. But now could not be ignored. For a moment, everything around him faded. Not the dock, not the threat, not the sounds, but everything else. Because in that moment, there was only one thing that mattered, the truth. And the truth was right in front of him, no longer hidden, no longer deniable, no longer reversible. Henrique closed his eyes for a second, just one, but enough. When he opened them again, he was no longer the same man, because now he wasn't reacting to a situation. He was facing a reality, and that reality changed everything. From that moment on, there was no margin left, no distance, no control, only direction, and it was irreversible. Henrique folded the document slowly, held it firmly, and without looking back, he made his decision, not in words, not in dramatic gestures, but in something far more powerful. Posture, focus, intent. Because in that moment, he was no longer the man who found 2 children on his yacht. He was the man who had just discovered who they were, and what that meant. Henrique didn't look at the document again. He didn't need to. The truth was no longer on paper. It was right in front of him, breathing, fragile, real. And that made everything else either irrelevant or completely redefined. He slipped the envelope carefully into his jacket, slowly, deliberately, as if it wasn't just paper, as if it was something that could not be lost under any circumstance. Then he stood up, no rush, no hesitation, but with a different kind of firmness, not the kind that comes from control, the kind that comes from decision. And then he looked back toward the dock. The figure was still there, but something had changed, not in them, in him, because now he wasn't trying to understand what was happening. Now he knew. And when you know, you stop reacting. You start acting. Henrique took a step toward the edge of the yacht, slow, visible, intentional. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't avoiding being seen. Quite the opposite. He was making himself clear. The figure at the dock didn't move, but there was a subtle shift in posture, enough to confirm something. They were waiting for this. "I understand now," Henrique said quietly. Not a question, not a threat. A statement, the kind that doesn't seek an answer, but triggers a response. And it did. Small, but real. The figure tilted their head slightly, as if acknowledging something, as if confirming the message had been received. Henrique held the gaze, steady, unshaken, and in that silent exchange, the situation shifted, because now it wasn't an unknown man facing a strange setup. It was someone inside a structure he had just understood, and that changed the balance completely. A new sound broke the moment, this time unmistakable. One of the children tried to move more forcefully, a faint sound, a fragile attempt to wake. Henrique turned, immediately, and in that movement, everything became clear, his priority. He moved toward them quickly, no calculated distance, no analysis, just presence. He crouched again, closer, careful, but no longer detached. "Easy," he murmured softly, not as someone solving a problem, but as someone protecting. And that difference changed everything. One of the children opened their eyes slightly. Confusion, fear, disorientation, all at once. Henrique held their gaze, steady, grounded, no aggression, no external urgency, as if trying to communicate something without words. And in that moment, it worked. Because the child didn't pull away, didn't panic, didn't resist. They simply looked at him. And that was enough. Henrique inhaled slowly, deep. And then he did the only thing that made sense. He removed his jacket and carefully placed it over them, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a direct action, concrete, protective. And in that moment, the story shifted completely. This was no longer a dangerous situation with external variables. This was an internal decision with unavoidable consequences. Henrique stood up again, but this time he didn't look at the dock first. He looked around, the yacht, the shadows, the blind spots, because now he understood something else. This wasn't over, not even close. The figure at the dock was still there, but no longer the center, just part of the equation, not the whole problem. Henrique stepped back, repositioning, thinking, but from a different place now, not from control, from protection, and that changed everything about how he would act. He looked again toward the dock. The figure had moved slightly, not much, but enough, as if they also understood something had shifted, and it had, because Henrique was no longer deciding whether to be involved. He already was, fully, and he wasn't stepping away. Not now. Not after what he had seen. Not after what he had understood. "This doesn't end here," he said quietly. But it wasn't directed outward. It was internal. A statement. A line drawn. Because the conflict was no longer external, it was personal. And when something becomes personal, it becomes inevitable. Henrique looked once more at the children, then at the document inside his jacket, then toward the dock. And in that moment, everything aligned into a single direction. He didn't know who was behind this. He didn't know why now. He didn't know what would come next. But he knew something more important. He knew what he would do. And that was enough. The wind moved softly across the deck again. The ocean remained calm. The silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence. Now it wasn't empty. It was waiting. Waiting for what comes next. Because something had already begun, and it wasn't going to stop.